It is with great pleasure that I am able to introduce our speaker today. We've been colleagues in the past, and I'm very happy that she's able to present today. This is Dr. Michelle Glinn. Dr. Glinn is a native of Detroit, Michigan. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree in anthropology from Wayne State University in 1985. Following her graduation, she worked at the Henry Ford Hospital Sleep Research Center as a research assistant, conducting studies on physiological arousal and insomnia in human subjects. In 1993, she received a PhD in biochemistry from Wayne State University, where her field of specialization was substrate metabolism and its relationship to neurochemical diseases. She spent several years at Eli Lilly in Indianapolis as a postdoctoral and visiting scientist, and then joined the Indiana State Department of Toxicology as assistant director, where she helped administer statewide breath alcohol and drug testing programs. In 1999, she joined the Michigan State Police as supervisor and program coordinator of the Lansing Laboratory Toxicology Program, where she also provided scientific support for the breath alcohol program. In 2011, she joined Timberlands, formerly Essential Testing LLC, a private clinical toxicology laboratory in Illinois, as laboratory director. In 2013, she signed on with AverHealth, formerly AverTest, a nationwide forensic drug testing company, as their contract laboratory director, overseeing their judicial drug testing program, and joined the company full-time in March of 2007. She is a guest lecturer at the Department of Pharmaceutical Sciences at Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville, Illinois, a fellow of the American Board of Forensic Toxicology, a member of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences Standards Board Consensus Body for Toxicology, and has served as vice president, and past president of the Midwest Association for Toxicology and Therapeutic Drug Monitoring, which is fondly known as MAT. So I am very, very happy to give you Dr. Michelle Glinn.
Hi, thanks, Norma. Although now that I'm listening to you, I think I want to hear the grave robbing talk. I mean, that sounds a lot more, very interesting. But anyway, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this will work. I'm seeing Norma. Okay. Oop. Does everybody see the slide that says old drug, new issues, cannabis and OWI in the recreational age? Is that on the screen?
We're not seeing it yet, Michelle.
You're not? Okay. So now, well, why did it work when we were just practicing? Okay, hang on. Let me make sure I have the screen share going. Are you not seeing it? Honestly, this is...
I am not.
Anybody else see it?
Michelle, I don't see it either.
You know, it's not giving me the option actually right now, where it did before. Okay, wait, let's see. Let me try this. Okay. There's always something, right?
I think you're almost there this time. Yes.
Okay. It has a picture of the courtroom and then slide title. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about today is cannabis, an very old topic, and driving under the influence of cannabis. And this is something that, you know, has been an issue for a very, very long time. And when I worked in Indiana with Norma, I mean, I used to go to court to testify on these sorts of issues. But the pendulum has swung a lot in the years since then. And so now we have cannabis in a lot of different forms now. It's legal in most states. It's sold as concentrates, as edibles, as all kinds of things. And there's also new cannabinoids that are present, we'll talk about. So now, how does this affect how people who are driving under the influence of it, and how courts are and governments are going to handle that? So we're going to kind of come back and revisit this. That's what I'm going to talk about. So I have to disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. I don't play one on TV. I have some opinions on legal issues. I have been in court a lot and a lot on cannabinoid cases. So a lot of this is going to be stuff that I've experienced or observed that I would like to share with you. But your mileage may vary. If you may have a different opinion after seeing some of what I have to say. So the National Institute on Drug Abuse has a lot of drug facts on driving under the influence of drugs. We should all remember that driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs is bad. It makes a car unsafe. There are a lot of drunk drivers who have been arrested or involved in crashes. But it's a little bit harder to get at not only how many crashes are caused by drugs driving, but also like what level of drug is safe and what level is not safe. It's really not nearly as straightforward as it is with alcohol. And we'll talk about why that is. And that's the thing that we really want to get at, how much is cannabis contributing to national statistics on fatal crashes and so forth. So in the absence of a lot of real hard and fast information, basically we should just all be careful and develop social strategies to prevent us from driving behind the wheel of a car while we are impaired. So says the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Marijuana legalization trends. This is a map from a couple of months ago from an online site where you can see it's easier to count the states where marijuana is still illegal, the gray ones. There's only 13 of them, Indiana being one of them. In all the green ones, adult use is legal, which means basically medical and recreational marijuana are legal throughout the state. And the yellow ones are where medical marijuana is legal. So in 37 of 50 states, you can legally use cannabis in some form or another. Marijuana has been around for a very long time. The first indication of using hemp fibers, which are a form of marijuana, was back as far as 4000 BC, where they were probably used as textiles of some kind. 27 to 2800 BC in China, cannabis was being used for medicinal purposes to combat things like rheumatism, malaria, constipation, menstrual disorders, absent-mindedness, which is sort of interesting, gout, pain, and convulsions. A lot of the same things that it's sort of being touted for today. In 1839, it was brought to modern Europe from India by Dr. William O'Shaughnessy, who advocated for using it for some of these other medicinal purposes. And in 1850, it was admitted to the United States Pharmacopoeia. The United States Pharmacopoeia, if you don't know, is the official list of drugs that can be sold in the U.S., both over-the-counter drugs and prescription drugs. So if it's a drug that the U.S. government recognizes as can be used for medicinal purposes, it's on the list of the U.S. Pharmacopoeia. And it was there for quite a long time. And in 1925, state law, the federal government started to try to standardize what drugs were being sold in what states. And in 1930, Harry Anslinger from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics wanted to outlaw cannabis. And he was the one person who really did not like it, claimed it promoted violent crime, produced anti-cannabis propaganda films and so forth, and really tried to get it removed from common use. In 1936, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics advocated that it would be prohibited. And in 1937, you had what was called the Marijuana Tax Act, and it was spelled with an H, passed against the advice of the American Medical Association. And what this did was to tax physicians who prescribed it and any pharmacies that dispensed it. A few years later, it was removed from the pharmacopoeia, and so as of 1940, you could no longer prescribe it. A few more in the 1950s, there were some mandatory sentencing and more harsh legal consequences for its use were brought into play. But in 1969, the U.S. Supreme Court declared the Marijuana Tax Act unconstitutional. So in 1970, in response to that, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act, where many of you are probably familiar with this different controlled substance schedules. So Schedule 1 are drugs that have no medical use and no reason for using them, and they're considered dangerous. Schedule 2, they're slightly less dangerous and so forth. Cannabis is now considered Schedule 1, which meant no medical uses and nobody should really be using it ever. And if you're caught using it, there are criminal penalties. 1973, Texas and Oregon began to decriminalize it. And I thought this was really interesting that Texas is one of the first states to do this because as of today, Texas was one of those gray states where it is still illegal. Decriminalizing it means basically not criminal penalties, just civil penalties for use of cannabis. And this happened fairly shortly after it was put onto Schedule 1. I didn't realize until researching this presentation that the decriminalization effort had gone so far back. Other states followed. 1978, New Mexico allowed medical use of cannabis. Other states try to follow, but you're also talking about state laws versus federal laws, and so there's a lot of regulatory confusion when you're looking at two different sets of rules. The three strikes law, if any of you remember, those were revived in the 80s, mostly for large-scale drug trafficking. And in 1991, San Francisco legalized cannabis dispensaries with Proposition P. 1996, California, all throughout California it was legalized, and then other states began to follow suit. And in 2008, Michigan approved a ballot to legalize medical marijuana. I remember this very distinctly because I was working with the Michigan State Police at the time, and all of a sudden, all of the rules attached to driving under the influence of cannabis had to change in response to this. And so it really, a whole lot of different changes that we'll talk about. 2012, Colorado and Washington. 2014, U.S. territories, Guam, U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and also Native American tribes began to legalize cannabis. The U.S. Department of Justice stated that Native American tribes could legalize cannabis on the reservations, even if the rest of the state it's illegal. So a lot of them did, took advantage of the commercial opportunities. And in 2018, Michigan approved recreational cannabis, so it is now legal for adult use as well as medical use. In 2020, South Dakota tried to just jump the medical hurdle altogether and just legalize recreational, straight out of the gate, although the Supreme Court struck that down. But anyway, you can see where this is going. 37 states, again, not including Indiana, have partially or completely legalized marijuana. Although federally, it's still illegal if it contains more than 0.3% THC, which we'll talk a little bit about in a minute. Now, when we're talking about cannabinoids, what we're talking about are compounds derived from the cannabis plant. And there are two cannabis plants that are usually cultivated these days, Cannabis sativa and Cannabis indica. They have well over 100 different chemically related compounds that are collectively referred to as cannabinoids. The ones that people are most familiar with or most popular are THC, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is responsible for all the fun effects of marijuana, and CBD or cannabidiol. And this is one that's come to prominence in recent years as it's considered to have more of the medical effects. It's not psychoactive, it doesn't get you impaired, or it's not thought to get you impaired or get you high, but it has some of the more anticonvulsant and anti-inflammatory effects that people are using marijuana for. THC itself is detectable in blood for about 12 to 24 hours at typical testing thresholds, but it can be detectable in urine for many, many days afterwards. Although urine, you usually see the metabolites, and in blood, you usually see the parent drug, THC itself, for a short time, and then you might see the metabolite for some time afterward. If you happen to test oral fluid, you'll usually see the THC itself. The cannabidiol, or CBD, is again considered to have medical benefits without the euphoric effects. And these are some of the things you'll see these sold as CBD oils or other products. And in fact, there's a formulation that was approved by the FDA called Epidiolex. This is made by GW Pharmaceuticals and was approved for serious forms of epilepsy. So the interesting thing about this is now we do have a federal government approved CBD product on the market for epilepsy, but CBD products are generally produced from what are called high CBD, low THC cannabis strains. It's still cannabis. They still have a little bit of THC present in the plant. So most of the CBD products that people buy, including Epidiolex, have some small amounts of THC in them. So even this federally approved, formally pharmaceutically made product has still got some THC in it. Not much, but a little bit, even though it's federally illegal. So again, the regulations can be very convoluted. Another interesting thing that we have to realize is that what's out there today is not your grandparents' marijuana. Back when I started in this business back in the 90s, the National Institute of Drug Abuse would do some THC studies, and they had THC strains that were 1% and 3%. And the 3% was considered the high THC strain. Some years later, 4 to 5 was more typical. 10 years ago, average THC content of your cannabis strain is around 10%. And this is what we have today, 18 to 25%. So the producers and the growers have been very busy. They've been developing these strains that are much more potent than they used to be. And you get a lot more THC, a lot more bang for your buck. And they also have special strains that will produce mostly CBD and not much THC. So you have a few in there. Some, you can see that Pennywise is about half and half. And then you've got some that are mostly CBD and not THC. So it's a lot more specialization. It's a lot more potent. And that really, again, opens up the door for a lot more situations, a lot more products, a lot more different types of things that are going on than they were, back in the day. Some other cannabinoids that you might see that are interesting. There's Delta-9 THC in red. That's the one we all know and love. CBD itself, a couple of their derivatives, THC acid and CBD acid, and those are usually states that allow THC. Usually wants you to test for these. One that's come along you might hear about is Delta-8 THC on the upper right there. And this one, if any of you are interested in chemical structures, you can look at the Delta-8 and the Delta-9, and you can see they're almost identical. There's a double bond that's in a different place in the molecule. So Delta-8 is sort of the new emerging thing. And if you're asking yourself, well, what's the difference? That's a good question. I think the difference is that in states where THC is still illegal, a lot of those statutes are written to say Delta-9 THC. So if what you're using is Delta-8, it's not Delta-9, therefore it's not illegal. It's not a natural cannabinoid. It has to be produced, but it's an upcoming thing. And it's a little bit difficult to test for because these two molecules are almost identical. So there are a lot of testing processes really can't distinguish easily between them. These are just some of the products that you can buy. You can buy gummies. You can buy chocolate-covered blueberries, you can buy concentrates, you can buy stuff for your pets, you can buy infused lubricant with CBD, all kinds of different things. And some of those are derived from hemp. Now, hemp is a variety of cannabis sativa that's grown for industrial use, and it's one of the oldest, cultivars of cannabis that's in existence. It's generally lower in THC, but it might be higher in the other cannabinoids. And it's been used for textiles, clothing, paper, food, since antiquity. You can buy hemp seeds and you can buy hemp oil and you can cook with them. And hemp is nowadays used often as a source of CBD. So when you have cannabis strains that are high in CBD and low in THC, they're often considered or called hemp. So and industrial hemp has recently been legalized. So in 2018, the federal government passed the Farm Bill that legalized hemp production for all purposes within parameters laid out in the statute. So basically you can grow hemp and it's legal, federally legal, and therefore legal in most states. So what's the difference? Marijuana versus hemp, they're the same thing, except they're both cannabis sativa. It's all down to how much THC is actually present in the plant. If you have a variety of less than 0.3% THC by dry weight, that's hemp, and that's legal, and you can grow it, and you can make fibers out of it or CBD products out of it. If it has more than 0.3% THC, it's marijuana, and it's illegal. So again, kind of confusing. You can't tell by looking at the plant which it is. You have to test the plant material to find out what the THC content is. Marijuana effects, we'll talk a little bit about what they're used for. I think this is pretty commonly known. They have stimulant, depressant, and hallucinogenic effects. The euphoric effect and the relaxing sedative kind of effect is what people generally like about it. There's also an analgesic effect. It helps with pain. It impairs learning and memory. It impairs space and time perception, concentration and attention, and psychomotor coordination. So these are all of the things that affect the ability to drive while you're under the influence of marijuana. It has a really pronounced cardiac effect that's not probably been appreciated too much. It does increase heart rate and appetite, lowers blood pressure, and it has other psychoactive effects as well as the sedation and the euphoria. The psychiatric effects have been known again for centuries. Back in the 13th century, it was described as leading to a consumption of hashish called led to insanity, as it were. Back in the 1840s, French physician Jacques Moreau described hashish intoxication is precipitating psychotic reactions. And back in the 1950s, they started kind of studying these in the lab. So there's a lot of studies, and if anyone's interested, I can provide you some talking about the psychiatric effects of cannabis, not just the pleasurable effects, but sometimes the things like paranoia or schizophrenia that can be brought on by use of cannabis, or schizophrenic-like effects. Cannabis has so many different effects. It's unique among most drugs this way because it acts on a couple of different receptor systems. The CB receptors are referred to as the cannabinoid receptors, and they're distributed everywhere. You have the CB1 receptors, which are the central nervous system, throughout the hippocampus, amygdala, basal ganglia, like all through the central nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord. And then you have CB2 receptors in the peripheral tissues, in the immune cells, in dendritic cells, and all over the place. So this one drug can have so many different effects because it's binding to these different receptors all throughout the body. It affects most body systems to some degree. And that's led to the claims that it can be medicinal in nature and it can treat all kinds of things. It can treat migraines, it can treat symptoms, seizures, it can treat ADD and PMS and Crohn's disease and glaucoma and Alzheimer's and all this stuff. These are claims made for this. And whether it does all of these things or not is probably, some it does, some it doesn't. But the reason given, again, is because it acts on all different body systems. There are some currently approved cannabinoid-based therapies. In addition to just what the local dispensary will provide to you, dronabinol is a synthetic version of marijuana. It's a synthetic form of THC that is found in an emulsion. That's been available for a long time for patients generally who are AIDS patients who have extreme weight loss, or cancer patients that have nausea caused by chemotherapy. And dronabinol or Marinol was prescribed to them to help them to be able to eat, to gain weight, to keep their strength up. There's a newer one called Nabilone, which is like a nasal spray that is supposed to, again, it's a synthetic cannabinoid. It's not exactly THC, but it's similar to THC that can counteract the nausea by vomiting caused by chemotherapy. And Sativex, which is a newer one, even newer one, a combination of THC and CBD, which is again supposed to be to help with seizure disorders and muscular sclerosis. And then again, Epidiolex, which we already mentioned. So there are some federal government approved cannabinoid-based therapies that are somewhat different than the medical marijuana that we're more familiar with. There have been a lot of peer-reviewed studies on the different claims for medicinal marijuana. The greatest evidence of pain relief are in studies of neuropathic pain. And THC does seem to have a pretty significant effect on that. And by neuropathic pain, we're not talking about a sprained ankle, or broken arm. We're talking about like diabetic neuropathy, pain that's due to nerve damage. If you break your leg or you sprain your ankle, your regular anti-inflammatories are going to be more effective or just as effective. But if you've got diabetic neuropathy, marijuana can help where some of the other drugs don't seem to. Again, for AIDS, wasting syndrome, nausea, and vomiting, we've already talked about that. And Crohn's disease, which is an inflammatory disease of the gut, there's a significant clinical response as well. Epilepsy, CBD, not THC, but CBD, does have anticonvulsant properties and does seem to help with treatment-resistant epilepsy, so some of the more severe forms of it. And then you've got things like anxiety and migraines. And there's anecdotal studies that show that CBD may help with those sorts of disorders. Some other things, glaucoma. When I was growing up, I had a cousin who smoked marijuana and claimed it was for his glaucoma. Well, I don't know if he even had glaucoma, but that's what he told me. On the other hand, it can help with that, but it's not any better than any of the other drugs out there already. So it's not necessarily the first choice of treatment for glaucoma patients. And there are a fair number of pieces of evidence that cannabinoids are anti-inflammatory agents. And this is, of course, a double-edged sword. If you've got an autoimmune disease like rheumatoid arthritis that's based on inflammation, use of cannabinoids may help you. But it could also depress the immune system, which could leave you vulnerable to other infections. The really, I think, scarier part of this is there are adverse effects on psychiatric health long-term. So there's a lot of studies, again, if anyone's interested, I can provide those to you, that long-term use of marijuana increases the risk of schizophrenia and some other depressive and anxiety disorders. You could have some long-term cognitive impairment. You could have long-term issues with pulmonary function, usually as a result of smoking. Just inhaling particulate matter into your lungs is not good for your lungs. So chronic obstructive bronchitis or pulmonary disorders, although not lung cancer. And again, there's a cardiac function. There's a significant cardiac component to THC, that it does cause increased heart rate and increased blood pressure, which is sort of interesting because if you overdose on THC, and we'll talk about how that's possible these days, it tends to be cardiac in nature. So there's a lot of different, again, things that can happen. And like many other, like cigarettes, like alcohol, the longer lifetime dose you do, the more often you use this drug, the earlier you start, the more at risk you are for developing some of these things long term. Addiction, up to 50% of daily users do meet criteria for substance abuse disorder, and that always is correlated with poor educational outcome and other diminished lifestyle satisfaction. And then there's overdose. As we saw, the THC content of cannabis strains are increasing, but you don't just have the smoke drug anymore. You can get concentrates that have THC content as high as 80 or 90%. You can have edibles, things like gummies or cookies or brownies that may not have a whole lot in one particular serving, but what's a serving? You know, is a serving a half a cookie, a tenth of a cookie? What if your child gets a hold of the cookie and eats 2 or 3 of them? These sorts of things are happening, and frank overdoses on THC are now possible and do end up sometimes being seen in the emergency room. So there's a lot of, if packaging is properly labeled and people read it, that could go a long way toward correcting some of these. But again, this is a problem that we didn't see a generation ago that now we do have to deal with. And then, of course, there's drugs driving. So THC and driving has been a long-term concern because basically, again, the sedation, the alteration of time and space, perception, and impaired information processing and memory deficits really all have very deleterious effects on your ability to drive a car. Usually what happens with THC impaired drivers is they have difficulty maintaining speed and lane position, and they have difficulty reacting to unexpected events. What tends to happen a lot is, you know, they might be driving along a road and they're not necessarily speeding. And if no one else is on the road, they're fine. But if somebody cuts them off, they don't process that they need to slam on the brakes or they need to swerve. And they may come to an intersection and not process that I need to stop at the intersection. They just keep going right through it and hit somebody. Those are the sorts of things that you see with THC impaired drivers. There's another aspect to THC and driving, which you don't really see too much with alcohol or other drugs, and that's the acute versus chronic impairment. THC has the acute effects right after you smoke it or use it, but if you're a long-term user, it tends to build up in the body and you tend to have chronic effects, even for sometimes many days after the last time you used it. That's not every user. Those are heavy users that, you know, when I was a kid, you kind of called them burnouts, and those like heavy users, even after they're not using, you know, recently still have some of the symptoms of impairment. So that also can be an issue, although it's a little bit harder to get at in a courtroom, of acute versus chronic impairment with the use of THC. And again, there's a lot of research on all of these different aspects of it. So we're trying to get at the idea of, now that we have more marijuana present in a lot of, there's more of it, it's stronger, you can get, it's all over the place. What effects does it have on driving, and what does it do for public safety? So there's a lot of driving studies out there, and we've had a few people try to do what they call meta-analyses, where they review all the studies and kind of summarize what each ones show and see if there's any trends. So Lee et al. In 2012 did, at the Journal of Epidemiological Reviews, reviewed 9 studies from 2001 to 2010, when this legalization trend was really taking off. And all of the different studies he looked at found increased crash risks with use of THC to varying degrees. So basically the consensus of all of this, you put it all together, is that using THC increases the odds of being involved in a fatal crash by an average of about 2.266 times. Anywhere, depending on the study, we'll find from twice to 3.4 times as often. So the conclusion of this paper, looking at the summary of these other papers, is that marijuana use by drivers is associated with a significantly increased risk of being involved in a motor vehicle crash. The same year in another journal, the British Medical Journal, another group of authors looked at 9 studies from a little earlier, from 1982 to 2007, and also found the same thing, increased crash risks with the use of THC to different degrees. And the consensus of all these studies, again, was basically around the same thing, about 1.2-fold increase in odds of being involved in a crash. So acute cannabis use is associated with an increased crash risk, especially for fatal collisions. So this seems fairly consistent and probably not that surprising. But what people really want to know, what happens a lot when I go in a courtroom and testify on these cases, is what blood level are we talking about here? Everybody knows about alcohol, and they know that there's a blood level of 0.08 grams per deciliter, and that's the legal limit. And above that, you're considered impaired, and below that, you may or may not be. Well, what's the equivalent for THC? And it's really hard to say. And the reason it's hard to say is because, unlike alcohol, THC does not stay in blood very long. After you smoke it, as we'll see, I've got a couple slides coming up, you know, the THC levels in blood peak and then drop, because THC is not water soluble and it doesn't really like water, and blood is mostly water. So THC leaves the blood, it gets taken up into tissues, and it's not, when you take a blood sample and you find out what the THC level is, a lot of times there's very little there. So it's really hard to correlate what the blood THC level is at the time of the blood draw with what it would have been at the time of the crash. And so you get all kinds of wide numbers all over the place, and it's really hard to say this amount means this. Nonetheless, there have been a few studies that show that anything above 5 nanograms per mil of THC in blood increases your risk of a crash, but it's not a regular, you know, you can't say that at 10 it's twice the risk of 5 or anything like that. It just means that if it's there, it's there. And here's an example of what I'm talking about. This is a study done in 2002 by Dr. Marilyn Hustis and her group at NIDA, published in Forensic Science Reviews. And when their subjects were smoking THC for the first like half an hour of the study, you can see that the THC levels go way up and then they come down real quick. So by about an hour, these levels are back down to below 20, and by 2 hours afterwards, they're like maybe 5. THC COOH, that's the metabolite. In the meantime, as your body's converting the THC into metabolites, that number rises, and that stays up there for quite a long time. But if you can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor. So if you're looking like out here, there's not a good correlation between these two. You can't look at 2 hours and say, I can tell from this triangle what the THC level would have been an hour before that. However, the acute effects of marijuana after smoking usually last about 3 hours, roughly 2 to 3 hours. So your blood levels of THC peak here, but you're still under the influence of it out here, where these levels are quite low. So how do you compare, how do you figure a certain blood level of THC means these types of effects? It's very difficult to do. And just because you can't measure it in blood anymore doesn't mean it's not there. Studies with deceased subjects, you can find THC in the brain while absent in the blood, because THC leaves the blood and it goes into fatty tissues, and the brain has neurons and myelin and all kinds of other insulating sorts of proteins, and that's where the THC ends up. So just because it's not in your blood anymore doesn't mean it's out of your body, and it doesn't mean the effects are gone. And there are, again, lots of studies on that. To get at the effects of THC itself on driving, the National Institute on Drug Abuse has done some nice driving simulator studies with the University of Iowa. So if you see this big, water tank type of thing on a platform here, there's a car in there. This is their advanced driving simulator. And from the inside of the car, it looks like this, right? You've got different types of scenes that just like a video game where you would, your car driving video game, except it's a whole lot more realistic, and they can tilt this thing and move it around so it really feels like you're driving. And we can study how people react to simulator studies under the influence of THC. So what they're usually trying to get at here is what they call lateral control, or weaving back and forth. Can you keep the car steady within the lane? You're not going back and forth from one end to the other. And longitudinal control. Are you keeping the car spaced evenly from the car in front of you? Are you speeding? How's your speed? How are you controlling your speed? So those are the kinds of things you can evaluate with this apparatus. And you can look at people under the influence of THC, whether it's inhaled or whether it's taken orally, with alcohol, without alcohol, urban, rural, what kinds of driving conditions are more affected by these different drugs and these different combinations. And basically what they've kind of concluded is that a THC equivalent of, say, 8.2 nanograms per milliliter in blood is roughly equivalent to about an 0.5 when it comes to lateral control, keeping the car straight and not swerving back and forth. THC of 13.1 is equivalent to about an 0.8. Well, this is quite nice for these studies, but you can get blood levels of them while you're actually, people are under the influence of it, whereas in the real world, you wouldn't get those, those numbers will be quite far out after usually the THC is consumed. As far as longitudinal control, following the car in front of you, THC decreases the mean speed, not speeding so much, increases the following distance, but alcohol increases speed. So these are things probably a lot of people kind of sort of intuitively knew, or it's sort of common perception that this is the case, but it's quite nice to have the numbers associated with this. DRE evaluations, these are just physical evaluations done by drug recognition officers. They're people who are police officers who are trained to look for psychomotor symptoms of THC intoxication. And there are these things here that are listed in this slide: heart rate, blood pressure, pupil diameter. These are characteristics of marijuana intoxication. And the cases are subjects who were found to have high levels of THC in their blood, and controls are drivers who are arrested who are not under the influence of THC. And basically you can look at all of these different things. If you're a trained officer, you can look at heart rate, blood pressure, responses of the eyes, and you can get a pretty good idea that it's THC that the person is under the influence of, as opposed to something else like, a Xanax or alcohol or something. There's quite a bit of a difference between the characteristics that the controls will show versus what the subjects who are impaired will show. The walk and turn, one leg stand, and finger to nose, these are standard field sobriety tests that officers are trained to give someone if they, drivers, if they pull them over because they believe they're intoxicated, whether alcohol or something else. These are 3 standardized tests where they can use to show that the person has adequate psychomotor control, or their psychomotor control is impaired. And all of these use of THC will increase the number of clues in all of these. Basically what it means is, you're going to fail your walk and turn or your one leg stand. You will miss your nose with your finger, those sorts of things. So the regular standard field sobriety tests are useful in establishing maybe that someone is under the influence of something. But again, the level of THC doesn't really make a difference here. You can't look at how many clues they have on the walk and turn and say that's a THC level above 5 or below 5 or above 10. What we're getting at is the amount in your blood is not really easy to correlate with the numbers of impairment, clues, or the symptoms of impairment that people will show. So the consensus on driving is that, and from all these years of study and these different types of simulator studies and epidemiological studies and all kinds of things, other lab studies, cannabis impairs driving. It impairs lateral control and typically leads to slower driving. You swerve, you don't speed, you kind of don't keep the car in the lane. It impairs information processing and attention. We all know this from other types of lab studies. So again, that might not sound like a lot, but when you're driving a car and you have to take note of your surroundings and what's going on around you, and you have to process when you have to swerve or whatever, if you can't do that, you're dangerous behind the wheel. It impairs performance on psychophysical tasks, on psychomotor tasks. And we didn't talk about this a whole lot, but the route of administration impacts experience and duration. If you take an edible, it's going to take longer to get into your system because it has to go through the GI tract, but the effects may last longer than when you smoke it because it's being sort of partitioned into your blood longer. So if you are using marijuana in one of these newer forms, you might be experiencing the acute effects longer than if you smoked it. Because the THC doesn't stay in your blood very long, the time of blood collection will drastically affect the THC concentrations, and the limited correlation, they're not very good at telling you how much THC is in your blood. So what this all comes down to is per se thresholds are not really supported by research for THC. And driving under the influence of cannabis is associated with an approximately double crash risk, but it's really hard to say how much cannabis you can use, and what blood level is safe, because it's just too much variability to draw any kind of conclusion. Now, so again, back to our original question. So it's so much more widely available now in so many different states, and it's been around for a bit. What are we finding about crash risks in different states, or numbers of drivers who are impaired? So that's been looked at. And basically, this article published earlier this year in the Journal of Alcohol and Drug Dependence has come to the conclusion that legalization of cannabis is associated with increases in cannabis alcohol poly use in the U.S. More of it's available, the more people are going to use it. And the more people are going to use it, some of those people are going to also be using alcohol. And so you're going to see this combination of alcohol and cannabis more and more. The British Medical Journal also looked at this and found out that while lifetime use of marijuana remains stable, past year use increased significantly between 2005 and 2018, and in all age, sex, race, and income categories, especially for those with high school education and above. Your grandmother could be using it, your aunts, your uncles. It's not just young people or college students. It's more available. It's more widely accepted. There are going to be more people using it, and that's what we're seeing. The prevalence of cannabis use is increasing throughout the year, independently of annual increases. This is another study from Alcohol and Drug Dependence showing the same quarterly trends in past month cannabis use. So again, it's becoming more popular because the stigma or the fear of legal consequences is diminished. There'll be more people using it. You can also go to the business literature, and Leafly, which is a website devoted to the cannabis industry, tells us that in 2020, there was a record amount of money spent on cannabis, $18 billion. It's a very profitable industry at the moment, 71% more than the year before. So a lot of money in cannabis sales. This is a slide from Sarah Erfer, who presented this at the SOFT meeting in 2016 from the Chemotox Laboratories, which she was the owner and director of. And this just shows that this driving cases, that the number of cannabinoid screens that their laboratory did for drivers who were arrested under the influence of cannabis, it just kept going up from 2009 to 2014. The number of requested tests that were positive and the amount of tests that were positive above 2 nanograms per ml THC just kept going up. So basically, what we can take away from this graph is that all the bars are getting higher as the years go on, because there have been more drivers who are apprehended for driving under the influence of marijuana, Colorado being one of the early states that made it legal. So not at all that surprising. Trends in motor vehicle crashes before and after marijuana commercialization in Colorado. In 2014, they found that the trend became, this is worded a little bit stilted, but the trend became positive in the proportion of drivers in a fatal motor vehicle crash that were marijuana positive. So more people driving under the influence of cannabis, more cannabis impaired drivers involved in fatal crashes, or the proportion of drivers was higher in fatal motor vehicle crashes. In contrast, that did not change in non-medical marijuana states surrounding it. So the proportion of drivers involved in a fatal motor vehicle crash went up in Colorado over this time period, but did not change in the surrounding states where cannabis was not legalized. So that seems to suggest to us that driving under the influence of, the more of this that's out there, the more people are using it, the more fatal crashes you're going to have, the more people who are impaired by it, right? Not necessarily. 3 years after recreational marijuana legalization, changes in motor vehicle crashes for Washington and Colorado were not statistically different from those in similar states. So if you're thinking, wait a minute, didn't the previous paper say something different? Not really. The previous paper said there are more people driving with it in their system, and the proportion of those drivers, involved in fatal crashes went up because there's more drivers who have it in their system, but the rate of fatal crashes didn't go up. So it's a little bit confusing here. You would sort of expect there to be more fatal crashes after marijuana became more widely used, but that did not seem to have happened, at least at this time, in Colorado and Washington. And then there's Canada. Marijuana is legal in Canada. I believe adult use is legal. I know you can get your insurance company to pay for your medical marijuana if your doctor recommends it. So they also have concerns about cannabis impaired driving in Canadian youth. And so there's a lot of recommendations in Canada. Again, cannabis impairs psychomotor skills. There's a modest increase in crash risks. But according to them, driving after drinking is more dangerous than driving after using cannabis. So drinking is worse. But if you put the two together, cannabis and alcohol together, that's very dangerous. And again, there's a lot of research on that combining the two is worse than either one alone. And again, young drivers are particularly at risk for this. Young drivers are usually at more risk for most types of motor vehicle crashes, just from lack of experience, but especially if they're using controlled substances at the same time. So again, to come back to the original question, how often does drug driving cause crashes? It's really hard to measure because at the roadside, you can't really get it. Usually you need a blood draw or you need, something like that, which you can't do at the roadside. There's not a breath test for THC like there is for alcohol. And if you have drugs in your system for several days after last use, how do you interpret those levels? So it can be hard to get at this. What level of THC is safe or not safe? What frequency of use is safe or not safe? And then again, I remember we talked about there's more than one cannabinoid out there nowadays. Delta-9 THC is the one that's really been responsible for most of the research and most of the things we've talked about. But now you have these CBD strains. So what does CBD do to driving? It's supposed to be an anticonvulsant, and it's supposed to be medicinal and not psychoactive. Are there any studies on what CBD does? Well, one just came out at the end of last year, and basically what they were claiming here, and this was done in the Netherlands, by the way, and in the Netherlands, they have driving simulators, but they also they will put people in a car under the influence of cannabis and put you out on the road with cars with like cameras on the wheels and an instructor in the car next to you and just let you drive and see what it looks like in real world conditions. So in this case, they basically had somebody drive during a 100-kilometer on-road driving test. They gave them their drug, and then 40 minutes or 240 minutes after cannabis consumption, put them behind the wheel of the car and said, go. And that's how they measured it. So really interesting studies. I'm glad I wasn't another driver on the road for some of these, but the upshot of this one on CBD is that CBD does not affect driving compared to placebo. So it's a small sample size, young drivers, not much, but it's the first study that's come out there, and it suggested that CBD can be used without significant impairment to the ability to drive. So now another thing that you get a lot of in court is what's worse, THC or alcohol? Because everybody knows about alcohol, we've all grown up with it. And a lot of THC users think either it makes them a better driver, or they say alcohol's worse, so it doesn't, they kind of justify it that way. And what I try to explain to juries and judges is that they're really very different. Even though we're familiar with both of them, it's hard to imagine two drugs that could be more different than THC and alcohol. They do different things to the users, and impairment by one is different than impairment by another. So it's hard to compare the two of them and say, because this one does this, then it's better or worse than that one. They're just different. And so after a lot of years of doing this and reviewing a lot of police reports and things like that, this is my opinion, and it's just my very, 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 very broad personal opinion, is that alcohol tends to make drivers reckless, but THC drivers tends to make drivers oblivious. Is one better than the other? No, probably not, but they're bad in different ways. But if you put them together, that's really bad. If you have alcohol and THC together, now you've got a reckless, oblivious driver, and that's worse than either alone, which is what most lab studies kind of show or get at anyway. This is my courtroom opinion, observer opinion. Your mileage may vary. And again, just to kind of compare what's called a retrograde extrapolation, if you're in court and they take a blood sample 2 hours after the crash and they say, what was the alcohol result 2 hours ago? You can give a pretty good estimation for what it might be under certain circumstances. This graph here shows alcohol metabolism, and it's pretty much a straight line for a good part of the way. So if you've taken a blood sample here, and you can kind of make a good estimation of what the alcohol level was here. But again, as we've seen with THC, you can't do that. If you take a blood sample here, what was THC here? It's difficult to say. You can't say. It could be here, or you could be here on this curve. You don't know. So you can't do a retrograde extrapolation with THC like you can with alcohol. So when you're in court and they want to talk about evidence, and what the law sometimes requires may or may not be what science can provide. And this is what we can say with THC. Any blood sample drawn more than a couple of hours after the stop will probably not have THC in it at all, or the THC will be very low. And there's not really any way to take that number and relate it backwards a couple of hours or 3 hours before and say, well, it would have been this at a different time. We have no idea what the THC blood level was. But just because we don't know doesn't mean it was out of the system. It doesn't mean it wasn't having any effect. It certainly could be there. The metabolite, that's THC OWI, is not pharmacologically active, but that really doesn't mean the subject's not impaired. It just means that some of the metabolites have been produced by the liver in the interim. And you can sometimes have chronic effects, as we talked about. If you are a long-term heavy user, sometimes days or weeks after the last use, you might still have some kind of impairing effects. What does that mean for, as far as the court's concerned? Hard to say. Now compare this to alcohol, okay? Any blood sample drawn more than a couple of hours after the stop, that's not true about, you can't tell what the THC level is, but you can for alcohol. It's not the same. You can do a retrograde extrapolation for alcohol, which you can't do for THC. If your blood is negative for alcohol, alcohol's gone. You're not under the influence of it anymore. Might be hungover, but you'll be under the influence of alcohol. That's not true of THC. Alcohol, we don't really look at metabolites, that we don't really try to relate those to impairment. And there aren't really chronic effects of alcohol like there are cognitive effects like there are with THC, at least not anything that's been documented. So again, even though these are two familiar drugs, they do very different things to the body, and it's really misleading to try to relate what we know of one to what we know of the other. So if you're in court and you're talking about THC impairment, basically the prosecution needs a lab report. It needs to show whatever the laboratory that tested the blood found. They need an officer and evaluation and the witness statements to talk about what the subject was, the drug driver was at the scene, what kind of symptoms he showed to substantiate that he was impaired. You'll need someone to explain to the jury that THC and alcohol are different, that the metabolism is different, the body handles them different, the impairment is different. But different doesn't necessarily mean better. And again, you'll get people who will say, well, I do this all the time and I know when I'm impaired and I wasn't impaired. The user is not the best judge of how impaired they are. And that's not true just for THC, it's true for all drugs. I mean, we all know the person who's obviously drunk who says they can drive. This is always the case. If you have a blood sample with THC in it, even if it's a very small amount, it generally indicates recent use within 6 hours or less. Generally. Not always, it could be longer, but most of the time it's out of the blood at levels that are detectable, typically within 6 hours. Or 6 hours or less. Carboxy THC generally indicates use within 24 hours, and you cannot correlate THC levels to impairment because THC just doesn't stay in the blood very long and the effects lag behind the blood levels. The higher levels will generally indicate heavier or more recent use, but just because you don't have a real high level of THC doesn't mean there's no effects. If you have a really serious crash, a lot of times it'll be several hours after the blood sample can be drawn, and you might not have any drug in the system at that point, or any drug in the blood. That doesn't mean the person was not impaired at the time of the stop. And if you take THC in an edible form, it might take longer to peak, and the effects might be longer, and the overall dose might even be higher. Okay. Sometimes you get oral fluid. There are a few states where you're starting to see that, and usually what you'll just see is THC in the oral fluid. You don't see the metabolite much. So that often will indicate current use or exposure, but you also have to remember if somebody is smoking it, you're going to get THC in the mouth from the cigarette smoke or from the cigarette. So you can't really, again, use levels here. You might get some ridiculously high levels, but it's contamination of the mouth with the material that was consumed or smoked, not necessarily the drug itself. Or if you're just in a car with other people who are smoking and the windows are all rolled up, you can be positive from secondhand smoke. If you have THC in urine, basically that just means prior exposure. So you really can't use that to determine any kind of impairment, which is important for driving, although you can use it for like sexual assault cases or drug use, or, probation cases, things like that, to get an idea if somebody is continuing to use the drug or if they're being exposed to it. And again, you can even be positive in urine from secondhand smoke under certain types of exposure conditions. So I kind of want to finish up with a typical, this is what I consider a typical THC OWI case, and it's one that I testified on a few months ago in Gratiot County, Michigan. And this case was like almost a complete regular, like average case in a lot of different ways. So I thought it would be sort of illuminating for to show it to you here. The at-fault driver was a young man, 27 years old, 5'7", 140 pounds, and this accident happened at on January 4th at 2:16 in the afternoon. He was on this county road, a 2-lane road. The speed limit was 55, and he was driving a utility van. He was at work, and that was actually the most unusual thing about this, is this is during his work shift. He came to an intersection. He collided with a small passenger car at the intersection, going approximately 61 miles an hour. So it wasn't really, not speeding. Speed limit was 55. He's going 61. That's not real significant. But in the passenger in the small car was dead at the scene, and the driver of the car survived. It was an older couple. The husband was driving. He was lifted to a medical center, but the wife was killed. And the at-fault driver, the young man, he had injuries to his knee, so they couldn't really do any field sobriety tests. And there you can see the accident scene with the skid marks. So the police interviewed him, and he said he smokes cannabis occasionally, and he last smoked the previous evening. So if you're any officer will tell you if they've asked somebody if they're smoking, or if they've been drinking, the standard answer is, I had 2 beers. So for cannabis users, it tends to be, I smoked yesterday, I smoked last night. So that's what he said he had done. He said he made a rolling stop at the stop sign and he went through the intersection, but he did not see the other car. And he claimed he didn't see the other car because he was emailing from his work computer while driving. So apparently this utility company he worked for, they had a computer in the car, and he was expected to email from that, I guess. And he didn't really remember it very well. The Michigan State Police did a crash reconstruction report, and they basically said he didn't stop at the stop sign. He just kept going, came to the intersection at 61 miles an hour, just went right through the intersection, and did not see the other car, did not process the other car, hit the other car. And there's the car there. So the blood draw was at 3:30. It was actually only an hour and 15 minutes after the crash, which is pretty quick. A lot of times there'll be much longer delay. A negative for alcohol, and 5 nanograms per mil of THC and 30 nanograms per mil of the metabolite. And I put those numbers up there because that's very, very typical of an OWI case. Those numbers are right kind of in the ballpark from MSP. I'm not there anymore, but when I was there, that was pretty much like a very, very typical level of those 2 compounds to see. So what do you say about all this? I mean, I would say I thought he used more recently than the previous evening, because this was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So the previous evening would have been, depending on how you define evening, I guess, at least 12, probably more like 15, 17 hours before. He has 5 nanograms per mil of the active ingredient in his blood. It's probably used a lot more frequently, or a lot more recently than the night before. The 5 nanograms per mil suggests use within the previous several hours, which implies some acute effects might be present. And he wasn't speeding, not really, but he didn't process that there was a stop sign. He didn't process that there was another car. He had other distractions going on, and those also could, reduce his ability to multitask. And just because you go through a stop sign, not speeding, it's not a good thing. That can be devastating. If you hit somebody going 60 miles an hour, it's going to be catastrophic. So that was his car. He survived. So basically, this is a summary of the consensus of cannabis and driving. The acute effects of cannabis ingestion include alterations in reaction time, perception, memory, attention, concentration, tracking, motor skills. The acute effects might be gone in 3 to 6 hours, but you can have more subtle impairment that lasts longer, and you can have chronic deficits. Although, if you stop smoking, eventually those will resolve. So there's not really any question that cannabis has a very detrimental effect on driving. The question is to what degree and how much can you use? And that's, again, something that's really hard to get at. But if you've got THC levels greater than 5, that has been compared to an increased crash probability comparable to that of drivers with a blood alcohol level of 0.15. Not saying 5 nanograms per mil is equal to an alcohol level of 0.15. The crash probability goes up considerably. So that's my presentation. So that's what we have as far as cannabis use, and we have to be vigilant with the increased numbers of cannabis drivers around us that we don't put each other at risk. So Thank you very much. And should I stop sharing, Norma, or how do you want me to?
Yeah, go ahead, unless you want to go back to your original slide or something, that'll be fine.
Okay.
We have one question that's one question that came through the chat.
Okay.
Are they seeing the same danger trends in states that have legalized all marijuana use as they are seeing in states that have only medical use legalized?
I believe so, yes, because Washington and Colorado are pretty much all legal now, and those are the ones that they said they don't have any increased crash frequency compared to non-medical marijuana states. So yes, I believe the answer is whether it's medical or whether it's recreational, I think the stats are all about the same there. And so, in Indiana, it's still illegal, but I know you have Indiana, you have Illinois next to you, and Michigan not too far away, so you're surrounded by states with drivers who use cannabis. So I don't know if there's any studies on spillover effects. That would be kind of interesting.
Do you ever get requests to come to Indiana to testify for cases? Like say if somebody says, well, I spent the weekend in Michigan or.
No, my EverHealth, the company that I work for, I do testify in Indiana because we have collection sites there, but not on driving cases. Typically, it's on probation violation cases. I do recall, though, in Michigan, at one point, it was legal to use the drinking age was lower in Canada than it was in the U.S. Or somebody who got arrested for drunk driving who was like 18 in Detroit said, well, I drank it across the border in Canada where it would have been legal at that time for them to do so. And there was a lot of consternation over whether they could charge this person with underage drinking because they consumed it in a place where it was legal. So, I mean, I don't know what they did with that, but it was, I imagine it'd be sort of a similar situation. I don't really know. But yeah, it could be an issue.
Well, we're not seeing any more questions pop up.
Well, thank you, everybody. I mean, it's a, I don't want to say timely topic, right? I mean, it's something that I don't think is going to go away, and we're going to have to come to terms with it one way or the other. So thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to talk to you all about that today. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it and learned a lot.